Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we've got a seriously special one for you today. It's a single brewer, single style, but they're both quite different, and they hold a pretty nice honor among these beers. So today we are going to be visiting Freemont Brewing Company. We've done quite a few beers from them, multiple different styles. All of them have been top tier. Today we are specifically looking at bourbon barrel aged Imperial Oatmeal Stouts by Freemont Brewing. This first one that we're going to sample here is the Rusty Nail 2017 release. Clocks in at 12.7% ABV. This one was brewed with brewer's licorice, smoked barley, aged on cinnamon bark, and then bourbon barrel aged for 15 months in 12-year-old bourbon barrels. And this holds the distinction of being the #1 ranked oatmeal stout in the world on Beer Advocate. Moving on to beer number 2. This is Fremont's Dark Star 2019 release, another bourbon barrel aged Imperial Oatmeal Stout. This one clocks in just lower at 12.4% ABV. This one is a blend of, I think it's a 24, 18, 12, and 8-month-old of this base beer, and then they added coffee to it, and this one as well was bourbon barrel aged, and this holds the distinction of being the #2 ranked oatmeal stout in the world on Beer Advocate. So 2 different beers from Freemont, both with similarities though distinctly different, and the #1 and #2 in the world respectively on Beer Advocate. So I'm expecting some very exciting beer drinking here. So without further ado, we're going to jump right in, starting with the Rusty Nail 2017 release, the Imperial Oatmeal Stout that clocked in at 12.7% ABV. Okay, jumping into the first beer of today's really exciting review. It's Freemont Brewing's The Rusty Nail, the 2017 release. It's a bourbon barrel aged Imperial Oatmeal Stout, clocks in at 12.7% ABV. Freemont is based in Seattle, Washington. Now, this one was brewed with brewer's licorice, smoked barley, aged on cinnamon bark, and then it spent 15 months in 12-year-old bourbon barrels before they finally pulled it out and bottled it up. The #1 ranked oatmeal stout in the world on Beer Advocate. So I think we're in for a really special treat here. In terms of label art, it's just a very clean design. And you can see it does have a nice wax dipped top here. So first thing first, we're just going to take our bottle opener and score directly underneath the cap. This makes it markedly easier to get the caps off on these wax sealed bottles. If you can just score underneath and just give it a good groove so it's got something onto which to grab when you get ready to pop it, boom, and first try it comes right off. So, and I do recommend a bottle opener that has a dual old school can opener design with that nice pointy tip. Those work miracles on these wax dipped bottles. So let's go ahead and get this one poured right into the glass here. Oh, that is absolutely pitch black and thick. Give that a little agitation. And I'm using my good all-purpose glass today because it's much taller and it does a very good job with stouts as well. So I figured we could get more volume in there. Yeah, this is truly pitch black. I mean, honestly, this could be the darkest beer I've ever poured. It was positively pitch black. It looked like motor oil coming out of there, used motor oil. And I mean that in a good way for an Imperial Stout. Pungent beyond belief aroma. I could smell it when I cracked the bottle and it was a couple feet from me. And indeed, I'm still a good 1.5 feet, almost 2 feet from this beer. And it's very pungent. So what I'm going to do is, yeah, it formed a pretty nice head. I gave it some agitation. It did a decent job. It's going to hang around a nice little pad here. Let's get right up and give it a sniff. Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Okay, so basically everything that they stated they put in this beer, you can absolutely pick up on the aroma. The bourbon does come through quite clearly, as you would anticipate, as does that licorice. It smells very nice, and it smells like it's going to pair very well with the other flavors that they put into the beer. The cinnamon bark that they aged it on, you can smell that quite distinctly as well. Same thing with the smoked barley. There is a slight smokiness to it underneath. So it smells like this just delicious amalgam of flavors. And there's a little bit of a suggestion of a vanilla-like and kind of sugary kind of back to it as well. So I'm not really sure what to expect when I jump in, but I do expect it's going to be delicious. So without further ado, let's do it. Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm liking everything about that. I'm liking everything about that. The flavors really absolutely work together in this beer. And on first sip, I could tell you, I could easily see why this is ranked on Beer Advocate as the #1 Imperial Oatmeal Stout in the world. This is properly delicious. The blend of flavors is not a blend I would ever think of, and boy, do they go so well together. So, there's a lot of complexity to this beer, as you might expect, but the by and large takeaway is exactly what you smell is translated directly into the flavor, and every bit of it speaks and has its own voice. So there's no vying for attention of any of its component parts. The bourbon comes through quite clearly. That does come through up front. I think immediately behind that, I'm going to have to take a few sips on this because it's very complex. The licorice came kind of right behind that. Then the cinnamon came right behind that. And then kind of the smoked barley came in right behind that. And I did mention kind of having slight aroma of vanilla and kind of some sugary side. There's a little bit of that play. And there's elements of this that kind of remind me of almost like, and it tastes nothing like root beer, mind you. But the component ingredients that they're using, a lot of them are shared in classic root beer. And those ingredients really do pair well in this beer style. And I think that smoked barley, and they didn't go overboard with it. It's got its own distinct character that comes through and lends just this very unique twist on this otherwise completely delicious blend of ingredients. And it just adds this extra layer of depth, but they showed great restraint here. It's so easy when using smoked barley, smoked anything, peated, doing any kind of beer style like that to go overboard and just let it kind of overtake the beer. It does not here. Everything has its own voice and it works in perfect harmony. So I'm gonna jump back in here for one more sip, get body and mouth feel, and start to think on this flavor development a bit more. The body on this one is really on the lighter end of medium heavy. It's not as heavy and not as oppressive and robust as maybe you would think for the style and certainly for the ABV range, but it has a nice presence. The mouthfeel, it's definitely got resistance to it, but it's not syrupy. And the resistance level really does pair more or less with the breadth of the body. So they are really kind of working in tandem there. It's maybe a little lighter than you would anticipate, but it's not a flat beer by any stretch of the imagination. It does absolutely have presence. In terms of kind of how this beer finishes out, it has a nice finish, and it's indeed longer than average, but perhaps not as long as one would anticipate for a beer with this big and bold of flavors and this ABV range and for the style. What you're kind of left with on the end, and it's very wet all the way to the end. There's no suggestion of dryness at all to this beer. It's very wet and it's packed full of flavor. And really where it finishes out is everything kind of pops in one at a time in the beginning, and then they all just kind of meld. And they all just meld together, and you can independently taste all of these component flavors all the way through, and it just slowly to the end kind of rides out. The last kind of bits that you taste before it finally finishes off and dies out on the end of the finish, it's just this lingering bit of licorice marrying with that smoked barley. It's very, very nice. Very, very nice. In terms of how they balance this beer, there's a lot of big, bold ingredients here, to be certain. And frankly, I think the balance, they absolutely nailed it. I mean, it's one of the reasons this beer is rated so high. It's a very imaginative ingredient bill, but it's just executed so meticulously that everything comes through, and yeah, you get it in these interesting little steps. Kind of, ooh, flavor step. Ooh, there's a new one, there's a new one, there's a new one. But that's part of the fun of it. And it's all coming through crystal clearly. Nothing's vying for attention. There's no, oh, that's so overbearing, I can't pick that out. Every bit of it comes out. They absolutely nailed the balance on this beer. Overall, I gotta say, I'm believing in this beer tremendously. This is an absolute joy. If you're a fan of Imperial Stouts, this is one. If you can still get your hands on a bottle, I absolutely recommend it. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get to the second beer of today's Freemont barrel-aged Imperial Oatmeal Stout review. That is their Dark Star 2019 release, and that one clocks in at 12.4% ABV. Okay, now moving on to the second beer of today's review, we've got Fremont's Dark Star 2019 release. This, again, is an Imperial Oatmeal Stout, bourbon barrel aged. This one brewed with coffee, slightly lower ABV at 12.4% on this one. And just as with the first, this one is also high up the list, the number 2 ranked Imperial Oatmeal Stout in the world by Beer Advocate. So we've got 2 really big beers by the same brewer here. If that first one is any indication, I expect we're in for another treat here, though completely different. This one's coffee. In terms of label art, yet again, it's just got a very clean design, so nothing too crazy to go on about. But yet again, we have this wax tip. So I'm pulling out my pointy tip. I'm just going to score right underneath the edge of the cap all the way around, all the way around. Now, this is easier on some. It depends on the type of wax and how thick it's on there. So this one's on a little thicker, but the wax that they're using seems to be pretty good at letting you dig down into it. So I think I'll be able to get right up under this cap. Yep, and pulled straight off. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes it is a bit of a fight, so no big deal. But let's go ahead and get this one poured right in the glass. Yet again, that is jet black. I mean, it's jet black. It's very, very thick. I'm going to try to give it some agitation here, give it a chance to form a head. It's just so thick. All right. Yeah, there we go. We got a little head rising. Okay. Yeah, this is absolutely pitch black. Formed a nice creamy, foamy head right on top. It's very thick, very creamy. This almost looks like it could have come off of a nitro tap. It looks fantastic. And the beer, it's also very pungent in terms of aroma. Though I gotta say, this one smells obviously completely different. This is a coffee stout. The other had all sorts of other interesting ingredients that were brewed in there. This one's just a nice oatmeal coffee stout, but it does smell quite pungent. So I'm gonna get right up over this for a deeper sniff. Oh yeah, so you can very clearly smell the bourbon back, the bourbon barrel quite clearly. No problem there. And you definitely do smell the coffee and some underlying elements of what smells like the malt bill to me. So I'm expecting this is going to be a classic barrel-aged coffee Imperial Oatmeal Stout. But we're going to jump in and see how this got rated so high on Beer Advocate. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Oh yeah. Oh yes, another delicious one. Oh, that's a big beer. That's a big beer. So I could tell you, the first thing I noticed as I was agitating around the palate, I could very clearly and immediately taste the bourbon barrel back as well as the coffee. Both are very bold and they're very equal. And indeed, that bourbon barrel and this coffee in this beer seems to be exactly what this beer is all about. And it's really a dead even 50-50 ratio. You're getting equal parts bourbon barrel, equal parts coffee, and both of them are very delicious. The bourbon is clearly a very high quality. They clearly used a good quality bourbon barrel, left it in there an adequate amount of time. Same thing with the coffee. It's not a super dark, not like French roast Italian on the edge of burned. It's just a really intense, bold coffee flavor. So a nice concentrated coffee. And it pairs so well with this bourbon. This is absolutely delicious. They're 2 for 2 on both of these beers. I mean, this is just incredible. Both of these beers are incredible. This one is no exception. So I'm going to jump in for body and mouthfeel, think on this flavor development. Body on this one is a solid medium heavy, maybe feels slightly more robust than the last beer. Is a little lower ABV, so you know, it is what it is. Mouthfeel on this one, similar to the first. It's definitely got a lot of resistance, but I wouldn't call it syrupy. In terms of what happens when you're agitating on the palate, this one does seem to get a bit more creamy than the first one did, but then again, this is a newer beer. The other one was a couple years old, 3 years going on, but absolutely delicious. The flavors are very big, they're very bold, they're very pungent, and it's just perfectly balanced for my money. Equal 50-50, and it is entirely about this bourbon barrel and that coffee. That said, you absolutely do get the malt bill coming through in this beer as well. And it's really pairing most with that coffee. It's clearly very thick, very dark, very concentrated, very rich. So it's got some very deeply roasted malts here. And it's pairing very, very well with that coffee. Tends to be in beers that have a good bold coffee presence in styles like this, that have those deeper roasted malts. They really do pair well together, and they just kind of build up off of one another. And that's no exception in this beer. It's absolutely delicious. In terms of the finish, yet again, this one's longer than average, but it's maybe not quite as long as you would anticipate it would be, especially considering how big and bold the aromas and the flavors are. It does finish again pretty clean, but this one does have a slight bit of dryness to the end that the first beer did. And this one's got a slight dryness on the back. So it feels a bit crisper, and it kind of makes the finish seem like it's going away quicker. Though if you're actually thinking about it, just sit here and think about it. I don't know, it's been 30, 45 seconds since my last sip. More or less, the finish is complete, but there is absolutely lingering coffee in particular that's lingering on the back of my palate. So while the finish in the traditional sense is more or less complete, the flavors do linger, so it really does more or less extend out the end of that finish, even though it's already got that slight dryness, crispness that finished it out. Very, very nice. Another absolutely delicious, absolutely huge beer. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both of these beers, we're going to get them ranked, starting with Freemont Brewing's The Rusty Nail 2017 release. These were both bourbon barrel-aged Imperial Oatmeal Stouts. This one clocked in at 12.7%, was brewed with brewer's licorice, smoked barley, aged on cinnamon bark, and then those bourbon barrels. It was 15 months in those barrels, and they were 12-year bourbon barrels. The #1 ranked oatmeal stout in the world, barrel-aged on Beer Advocate. Based in Seattle, Washington. So, for the aroma on this, absolutely massive. I mean, just absolutely massive. This was easily one of the most pungent aromas I've ever smelled on a beer. 3 feet away, you could still smell it. And the closer you got, the more you could pick up all of the ingredients they put in there. They really came through. It's a perfect 10 out of 10. For the taste, very much like the aroma, the taste was absolutely incredible. It's a blend of ingredients I never would have thought of in a beer, but they absolutely worked beautifully together. This was just masterfully executed. 10 out of 10. For the body is one of the categories on this beer I was a little surprised by. This is a very high ABV Imperial Oatmeal Stout, and it wasn't lackluster, but it was nowhere near as robust in terms of the breadth of the body as I was anticipating. Just high end of average here, it gets a 6 out of 10. Mouthfeel, same story as with the body. While they did very much pair together, the body and the mouthfeel very much felt hand in hand. The mouthfeel, again, I expected a lot more resistance, especially in this ABV range on this beer style. Again, high end of average, it gets a 6 out of 10. For the finish, this is yet another category I was kind of surprised by. It was above average, but with a very high ABV and that big and bold of a pungency of flavors, I really expected the flavors, let alone the bourbon barrel aging, to really extend the finish on the back end. and it was longer than average, but nowhere near top tier. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the head and retention, this one did okay. It did above average. Granted, this is an older beer. They do tend to lose their carbonation over time. An oatmeal stout that was a great platform for having the best shot of getting the best head creation and retention at home. But bearing again in mind, this is a 3-year-old beer. They do lose carbonation over time. And indeed, a beer this high ABV range, it is naturally going to be thicker. So it is a little harder to create a really nice head, such as you'd get off a tap at a bar. But this, again, was above average. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the appearance, it was absolutely pitch black. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the balance, I would not have changed a thing about the balance on this beer. It had a lot of ingredients kind of working together, and all of them had their own voice, and they worked beautifully and harmoniously together. 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible, I absolutely loved it. I absolutely loved it. This was one of the most unique, certainly stouts I've had, let alone Imperial Oatmeal Stouts, and it was just a real home run across the board for me in terms of the beer drinking experience. I really enjoyed it. All the flavors were big, bold, pungent, and just beautiful. Gave it a 10 out of 10. Finally, is an example of the style. This beer more or less blew me away. Where it did lose some points, they were reasonably significant in the grand scheme of things. But honestly, this beer was just so exquisitely delicious that even though it did lose 4 points in one category, 4 in another, then 3 in 2 other categories, I think I'd be doing the beer a disservice to dock more than 1 point overall as an example of the style. It gets a 9 out of 10, which brings the total score on Freemont Brewing's The Rusty Nail 2017 release to an 85 out of 100. Well above average. I could easily see why this is the #1 rated beer on Beer Advocate for the style. It truly was delicious. If you can get your hands on a bottle of this, you're in for an absolute treat. Moving on to beer number 2. This is Fremont's Dark Star 2019 release, same beer style, slightly lower ABV on this one at 12.4, and this was also bourbon barrel aged, but then brewed with coffee. The #2 ranked for the style on Beer Advocate. So, starting with the aroma. The aroma on this beer was equally as obscenely pungent as on the first, and I mean obscene in the most nice way. It was obscene how pungent it was, but it was truly a joy to behold. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the taste, just as with the first beer, I was absolutely blown away. I loved everything about this beer. Malt bill came through clearly, bourbon barrel came through clearly, coffee came through clearly, and they were big and bold and pungent. It gets a 10 out of 10 from me. For the body on this one was a bit more robust than on the first, but again, I was still surprised at it not being heavier than what I would expect for this beer style in this ABV range. Above average though, it gets a 7 out of 10. Mouthfeel. Same story with this beer as with this one. The body and the mouthfeel very much went hand in hand, but it wasn't as resistant and viscous and silky as I expected for the beer style in the ABV. But it did match the body. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the finish on this beer was quite long. Very, very, very long. And really, it was slight suggestions of lingering bourbon, but the coffee that really helped to push it out. It was so bold and pungent and just wonderful in its intensity. It really, really did extend the length of that finish a very long time. It gets a 10 out of 10. Head and retention. This is 2 years newer beer, and it absolutely showed. It poured wonderfully, honestly. If all stouts I got poured at home created and retained a head like this, I'd be a happy, happy man. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the appearance, just as with the first beer, it was absolutely pitch black. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the balance, yet again, both of these beers, I mean, just exquisitely balanced. Perfect malt and coffee and bourbon barrel ratio that came through just absolutely perfectly. I wouldn't change a thing. It gets a 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible, I loved it. This one also gets a 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, this one only lost 3 points in 2 categories, body and mouthfeel. But overall, just as with the first beer, I thought it was so strong that I limited my point docking because I don't want to have a few little outlier categories affect the bottom line. When it comes down to it, this is a tremendous example of what a barrel-aged Imperial Oatmeal Stout can and should be. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. which brings the total score on Fremont's Dark Star 2019 release to a 94 out of 100. Yet again, well above average. We're only looking at a 9-point spread here, 85 and a 94. Both of these beers are absolutely top tier. I 100% can see why Beer Advocate has this as the #1 and #2 for the style in the world. If you can get your hands on either of these, I do highly recommend you do so, because they were truly delicious. Some of the best stouts I've had in a very, very long time. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you just click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.